And so we're in the back chatting away, and the curtain parts, and there's Don Stanislaw Dziwisz, who was Pope's private secretary. And he looks, and everybody's silent, And he looks out over our heads and he says, "Delia Gallagher." And I said, what? He just called me. And he took me up to meet the Pope. And that was the first time I met him. And so he's sitting down, John Paul II, looking out the window because the pilot had decided to fly low 3 times around.
All right, well, here we are in Rome with, for Pete's sake, Delia Gallagher, long-term Vatican correspondent, analyst, knowledgeable in so many different areas, doctorate from Oxford University, overall Vatican genius. Welcome to the pod.
Well, thank you for such an introduction. It wasn't a doctorate, by the way, a master's.
Oh, well,
yes,
let's pretend.
A few years short, but I'll take it. They used to call me Dr. Delia.
Oh, I love it.
When the local TV would come over, and they'd say, "Theologian, Dr. Delia."
Yeah. That's what I got.
Yeah, well, exactly. And it's partially, true, because in Italy, when you have just your BA degree, you're called doctor.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, they do that here. So I'll take it.
Yeah, given. Absolutely given. Your knowledge in Vatican is so extensive. I think they should just give you one, just to be nice. I feel like that's given. Oh my gosh. Yeah, so it's been, you began with JP2.
Yes.
You've been here a lot longer than I have. I'm fresh. I'm a newbie.
Yeah.
But you're well-rounded here and well-established. But oh my goodness, how did you even begin?
So I studied philosophy and theology, my master's at Oxford with the Blackfriars, Dominicans. And, what are you going to do after that? So I came to Rome, and I had a few friends in Rome, and I just thought, well, let's just check it out. And I started working because that was the most important thing, to pay the rent, and came to a small magazine called Inside the Vatican, which was a monthly magazine. This is pre-internet days, pre-cell phone.
Different time.
Yeah. I think maybe we had a little Nokia cell phone, that you can make a phone call on, but certainly not internet. So it was a monthly magazine, and it's still around, and it's on the internet. And the editor was a man named Bob Moynihan, and he is still the editor. And I learned so much from him. He is a Catholic intellectual with a poet's heart, and he knew his way around the Vatican. And so I just kind of trailed along with him to Cardinal Ratzinger's offices and all of the press conferences and so on. And so I was working on that magazine when the sex abuse crisis in Boston came to light, and John Paul II in 2002 called over all of the American cardinals, and all of the U.S. networks came as well. Obviously, it was a very big story, and there was really very few of us here who were English-speaking and willing to go on television and to talk about it. So that's how I got my start then in television, and worked for CNN mostly for the last 20 years, and also CBS in different periods, because in the meantime I had 2 children and so on. So yes, I've done a lot of television, mainly in the last 20 years and the last 3 pontificates.
Wow, 3 pontificates. Oh my gosh. How have you seen...
Well, now we're on the 4th.
Well, now, yeah, we're in the middle of it. The beginning.
It's just beginning.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's so much time, and so much has changed. Even you referenced from the very beginning, look at that technological advance.
Yes.
That's a massive difference, a weekly to what we have now, which is like an ongoing stream. What have been some of the biggest changes?
Well, I think about that all the time, because now, I'm older, I can hardly keep up with it, but I see the younger generations that are able to so quickly get out. You're at a press conference and they're just tweeting out every line. And I think there's a lot of advantages to that. Obviously, you get a lot of information and you get it very quickly. On the other hand, what you miss or you can miss is the analysis, the overall picture. Why is this important? And that's something which I think experience gives you, and time. And time is what we don't get with social media. And so, when I went on papal trips with John Paul II for a monthly magazine, I didn't have to write anything on those trips. And I went on breakfast, lunch, and dinner with the old Vatican journalists who were Wikipedia in their head and gave you all of the stories of previous pontificates back to Pius XII, Paul VI, so John the 23rd. They had been at Vatican II, some of them. And there's a great deal, obviously, that's immeasurable, but important, that can be learned just in those kinds of sitting around and listening to the old people tell their stories. And we don't have a lot of time for that today. Now, maybe something like podcasts can kind of make up for that,
right?
Because obviously the format can be a bit longer. So it's very interesting, isn't it, that podcasts have taken off precisely when we don't have anymore that kind of sitting around and chatting and listening to the stories, because everybody had time. Nobody was rushing around. And you had to go to the press office in order to get the daily bulletino on a piece of paper to know what the Pope's appointments were or any information. You had to be there physically.
Right.
So that meant you were talking to your colleagues in a very leisurely way, but I don't mean to say by that, not intense.
Right.
There was a lot going on, obviously,
right.
But yes, it was much more the measure of the man kind of situation. And I think I look back on them as great times.
I'm jealous. I'm so jealous. There's so many times and you had that.
Yeah, and you had time for long lunches. You'd go out. You'd meet, obviously, the cardinals. I mean, Cardinal Ratzinger went by every day through the square. And so, yes, it was a slower time, and there's a lot to be said for that. I think people today do want to kind of get back to that, but it's very difficult.
It is interesting. I mean, you have so many technological advances to make things so efficient. And then at the same time, I think there's this human desire that you can't really curb to just sit around a campfire and tell good stories.
That's right.
For a very long time.
That's right.
And that's why I think this sort of thing comes back around.
Yes. The podcast in some way can do that.
Yeah. It's more like a dialectic than anything else in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful. But it's so interesting because I wonder, was there ever a moment where you thought, okay, this is it, it's over, we're never going to go back to long form? Because the podcast is a very recent development. Was there ever a time when you look back where you go, oh my gosh, like this is really massive. This is, okay, we can't go back?
I think, long form in television is maybe 7 minutes, right? If you're doing a TV piece. And written journalism, you could have magazines that maybe would do a bit of long term. But no, the momentum of, I would say, especially Twitter and getting everything out there really quickly, which happened, in the middle of Francis's pontificate, basically, was certainly a turning point.
Yeah.
Where I thought journalism has definitely changed.
Yeah.
And all of the social media where you take pictures of yourself in the different places. So like a lot of the work that I've done, a lot of the places that I've been, I don't have any pictures, but I have the memories in my heart, which form you. And sometimes maybe when we take pictures, we don't stop and absorb what's going on. So we've got thousands of pictures, but maybe we don't even remember.
Yeah, the focus is elsewhere. Do you think, I know Leo recently has really come forward with this anti-AI sort of position where he's, not necessarily anti-AI as a whole, but that it's one of the biggest challenges to human dignity now. He's one of the first world leaders sort of to really put it at the forefront of the moral thought and conversation. What is he seeing that you think other world leaders might be missing?
Well, I'm really glad that he's taken that as possibly a sort of priority. Certainly if he's mentioned it in the first month of his pontificate, it's on his mind. I wouldn't say he's anti necessarily, but yes, very concerned about it. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in Francis's pontificate, we did have a few conferences about AI, and some of the offices at the Vatican are also have been working on that for a few years and invited over sort of the heads of major tech companies to discuss the challenges of AI. And I remember I moderated one of those conferences, and I remember thinking at the time, the Vatican has got to really take the charge on this, because a lot of the AI questions are ethical questions. And so the combination of people who have the technological know-how with the ethical questions is what you need, and the Vatican is well placed to do that, even in the pontifical universities, for example, to do some kind of coursework where people can merge those two issues. And I was pleased to see that there is a lot of interest on the side of tech companies also to participate in those kinds of conversations. So I think it's very exciting that Leo is going to make that a priority of his pontificate. I think there'll be a lot of good that the Vatican can do, and the Catholic Church in general, with those discussions.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I feel like for a little bit there it was a bit of a cold war between countries as to who can develop their AI systems the fastest. But now we're seeing this sort of reaction, this gut reaction from across all aisles. This isn't just, left, right, anything, rich, poor. It's, okay, actually, before we develop this a lot quicker, maybe we need to think through it all, which is not, we've had this before with technologies, but this is the first one where there's so much potential for good.
Yes.
That you might overlook the potential for bad.
Yes.
Yeah.
And brings up the whole question of, what is it to be human, and what is the extent to which these robots can actually mimic our human life, and all of those wonderful questions that the Catholic Church has, for a long time devoted itself to. So I think they have a lot to offer in that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it will be interesting, especially on the worker front and on the economic front, obviously. Pope Leo, the name itself inherits quite the tradition of workers' defense, and so yeah, I think it goes hand in hand. It'll be very interesting. Did you think at any time when the technology was developing, this AI issue where it's like a human dignity issue with social media, was that also something as you were watching it that you were like, this, social media itself is a human dignity issue minus AI?
Well, yes. I mean, also, I have two children that are 12 and 10, don't have cell phones yet, but, that's...
Congratulations.
Yes, I know. Really.
Yeah, no,
a lot
genuinely.
of them do, yeah. So that's a question, also a very personal question. And so I realize that it is for a lot of people. It's not just something out there like some robot in space. It's really what is happening to the minds of our children, and therefore future generations, with their attention span, with the things that they can see on the internet, and with the whole concept of self. And so if a child gets a phone, we made a birthday cake for my daughter, and she said, "Oh, let's take a picture of the cake." And she took my phone instead of, I thought she would point it at the cake, but it was her and the cake and me. We all had to get in. And so even those kind of small changes that you notice with young children, it becomes me as the center of the story, which also happens in journalism. And that's a big change, because it used to be you're out of the story as the journalist. You're just telling as a kind of omniscient narrator. And then there was a change some years ago where now the journalist needs to put themselves in the story even more. And that's a big change also with social media. The people that are following you, you need to show them who you are and develop that kind of a trust and so on. There can be good sides to that too. I think that's interesting. But there's a balance there, right?
Totally. Well, because I think, because while you share and it becomes more real, and you're able to find so many communities now that probably didn't exist because of this personal storytelling aspect and the individual taking the center, I suppose you also lose a good bit of privacy and you lose a bit of yourself. It's sort of a trade-off.
Yeah, and you're always checking, like, how many people watched my video or whatever. I think that's a real problem.
The identity.
Yes, because then if people didn't like your video, who are you?
Right.
So that's tricky, because everybody has that now, right? And even if you're not a journalist, you're still checking if people liked your video.
Yeah, I'm really sad about it right now.
Right? I mean, we'll have to see how many people listen to the podcast. Exactly. It just becomes like this kind of crazy thing. Whereas what you really need to do is offer good content, whether you're in it or you're not in it or whatever. And I might be an old timer, but I think that good content still really matters. And that's, at the end of the day, what's important and what will help people the most.
Right. Yeah, because, well, although it's changed, people don't change. Like, the technology changes, but people, I suppose, remain the same. Was there ever a moment, speaking of content, where you were with the popes, maybe JP2, I don't know, but you were like, this is it, this is the moment, this is like the story that this is history?
Oh, well, every conclave, obviously, certainly the last one.
Definitely.
John Paul II, I was the last, let's say, 5 years of his pontificate. He died in 2005. And so a lot of the history he had already made, and he sure did make history. And there were not moments where I said, oh, this is history. I kind of get that feeling a lot of the time. Even just coming down to the Vatican on a regular basis and just seeing St. Peter's Basilica and realizing the history of this place and the privilege to be able to live here and work here. So it's not so much a moment that would stand out in any one of the pontificates like, wow, this has changed history, with the exception, of course, of the election of an American Pope. Mm-hmm. But you could even say the same for Francis, right? An Argentinian Pope. Those were all historical moments. But I always have the sense just of, on many, many occasions, and certainly when I travel with the popes, of being a part of something very important and very unique. And so I just love a lot. I have a lot of memories, lots of little moments of their own personalities and their own quirks and so on. But, those aren't really extended to sort of a major historical moment, as it were.
Right. And when you were with John Paul II, Pope St. John Paul II,
yes.
Was that...
we should remember.
We should be appropriate. It's a long title, but it's a necessary one.
Yes.
I know he was the traveling pope for most of his life. Was that still the case in those last 5 years?
Well, yes. Gosh, he was just nonstop. So his pontificate was 26 years. And actually, my first papal trip was his last one to Poland, which was such a blessing for me because, again, I was working for a small magazine. I was a newcomer. There were all these wonderful old-time journalists who covered his whole pontificate on this plane. And, he used to go back to the back of the plane and chat and give sort of interviews and things, but mostly chat with the journalists. But by the time I got on, which was 2002, he didn't do that anymore because he was already quite ill with Parkinson's. And unbeknownst to me, we go when we're taking off from Krakow at the end of the trip. And as soon as the plane takes off, we're all in the back. The journalists are always in the back of the plane. And then you have kind of in the center the Swiss guards and the gendarmerie and the security. And then in the front, you have the cardinals and the Pope. And so we're in the back chatting away. And the curtain parts, and there's Don Stanislaw Dziwisz, who was the Pope's private secretary. And he looks, and everybody's silent, And he looks out over our heads and he says, Delia Gallagher. And I said, he just called me. And he took me up to meet the Pope. And that was the first time I met him. And so he's sitting down, John Paul II, looking out the window because the pilot had decided to fly low 3 times around Krakow so he could see that was the city of his birth, and it was his last trip. And so I sat down next to him. He held my hand, he stroked my hair, and we looked out the window as he was saying goodbye to Poland. And that was my, I think, introduction to flying with the popes. And he was not physically well, but he had that kind of eye was open, and he looked at you, and he was still present. But at that particular moment, he was praying, and so I just prayed with him and sat and held his hand. But he was very mentally acute. One story in St. Peter's Square, and he was doing his, audience, and he was reading his paper and he was reading his speech. And he had a hard time breathing, you could kind of hear it.
Right.
But he was reading away, and the crowds, just love it. You can't imagine the crowds for John Paul II. It was like nothing since. But anyway, and so at a certain point, he stops to catch his breath, and he doesn't pick up his speech again. So he was already with his head kind of low and doesn't pick up his speech. And so the crowd starts cheering, and John Paul II, we love you, and he still doesn't pick up his speech. Now, we're all in the press office watching it on a monitor because you had to watch him really closely. So we were watching on the monitor. And there's kind of silence, panic, like, oh my gosh, something's happened because so much time was going by and he wasn't. And the crowd was, chanting away. And so then I see him and he's kind of like this and he goes, and with his hand kind of trying to get the crowd to go a little bit louder. And I'm like, what is he doing? And so Don Stanislaw comes around from behind the back of the altar and he goes, and he taps his paper like that. And the Pope goes, they're telling me to get on with it. So like it must have been like 5 or 7 minutes, which was an eternity. And we're like, oh my God, he's done. And he was totally playing the crowd. He just loved it.
He was such an actor.
Right? And that was that was probably 2001, 2002. And he didn't die until 2005. So he was there mentally,
My goodness.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Right?
He knew the entire time.
Yeah.
He just wanted a louder crowd.
Like,
and knowing the crowds back then, it must have been super loud.
Oh, it was crazy.
So he was just...
He was loving it. I mean, I'm sure he had to take a breath too,
Yeah,
and he was just like enjoying the moment.
Yeah, totally.
But everybody else thought something really bad had happened.
Oh my goodness. So, but when you met him, why did that happen? What was that on the plane?
So the reason that happened is that, unbeknownst to me, my wonderful colleagues knew it was my first flight, and they wrote a little note and sent it up to Joaquin Navarro Valls, who was the spokesman at the time, and asked if I could meet the Pope because it was my first flight. And they did that for me.
Wow.
And I always remember that because, in journalism and there's competition and colleagues and so on. But I benefited so much from the generosity of my colleagues when I first started. And I really take that as a priority for me now, 25 years later, to remember that it's not about who you're working for or who wrote the better article or who got the most TV time or something. There is an important camaraderie that I think needs to be constantly at the forefront of your mind when you're talking about working with colleagues, especially because you work so closely together and traveling and so on. And so I take that as one of my main examples of work life. Amazing. And how wonderful it can be that colleagues can do that for you. They didn't have to do that.
Yeah. Wow, how incredible. And it's so true because honestly, if the end goal is telling the truth and recounting history well, which as a journalist, you're generally trying to do, the camaraderie makes a lot of sense.
Well, also with the Vatican, as with probably, I don't know, maybe the White House or other places, you rely on the colleagues that have been here longer because there is just a lot of information that you need to know. The Vatican's language is Italian, so a lot of the people that start here, as indeed I didn't speak Italian when I started, so and the language is Italian, but it's also very ecclesiastical. Mm-hmm. So it's a special kind of Italian. And the documents that they put out, are very thick and very long. And you have to give a summary of that in, a few hours time. So you rely on your colleagues for help.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really important, thing to maintain.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's one of the few fields, I suppose, left where you can't really get that information elsewhere. That sort of contextual information, that sort of knowledge that goes through experience, not through, some Google whatever.
Well, right. Exactly. Yeah. Because unfortunately, you can get a lot of facts maybe, but you've got to be able to put them in some kind of coherent analysis. And a lot of that goes on here then. So people will ask, especially journalists, let's say for secular outfits that aren't specialized Vatican people, will often ask people like myself, for some kind of context.
Yeah, absolutely. Your first flight was with JP2, but then you traveled with Francis as well. Yes. And I'm always curious about this because Francis, I think of him as a friend and also a reacher. Like he reached areas that were previously unknown or unfamiliar to the church. And I'm always curious about the people who followed him. Was there ever a time where you were like, you should turn back? This is too far, that, this country just isn't safe. Was there ever a time that you had anything like that with Francis?
Well, I mean, there was Iraq for a start during COVID.
Yeah.
There was the Central African Republic, which did not have any form of government at the time. And we were just kind of, accompanied by literally UN tanks. So yes, he went to some dangerous places. And I actually thought in the run-up to Iraq, a lot of us thought he would cancel it because of the COVID and just because it was dangerous. There had been a bomb in the north of Iraq, and it was just not a safe moment. But he did not care. He was just, and of course, the point is that if somebody is trying to take the Pope out, he's got security, but the rest of us straggling behind him.
I always think about that.
Yeah, well,
he's covered.
Me too. Yeah. But actually, looking back, there's massive security for those kind of events. And also, the host country doesn't want to have egg on its face and be the country where something happened to the Pope. So, everybody is on their best behavior. And
they postpone the bombs.
Yes, which is terrible because obviously, you want to feel like a papal trip and a Pope being there was going to make, suddenly bring peace.
Right.
And it doesn't really happen like that. But I think what it does do is, first of all, allow people in the country to know that they're being thought of, and that somebody as important as a Pope, because these are countries where maybe they're not even Catholic necessarily, but that they haven't been forgotten, that somebody at the stature of a Pope is willing to go and bring attention, even if it's only for a short time, to their situation. Totally. And that's worth a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, even the transition from Francis, whose focus was so much on that outreach, and then to Leo, whose focus is still so much so peace, has been such a primary focus. I think we're going to continue to see that, I imagine. I mean, he's made it known that Ukraine and Gaza and all these places are very much so on the forefront of his mind. And I don't think it's inauthentic. I don't think that, it's just a diplomatic ploy. That really is their position in a lot of ways to really try their hardest to continually push for peace.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're one of the few, let's say, governments, because it is its own country, Vatican City State, that can have that kind of moral stature, so they can sort of say, you need to have peace. Mm-hmm. Now, can they really, what can they do then in a kind of more practical way? Well, they can offer to be mediators, which they have done before. And then also they have a massive network throughout the world of Catholic churches, of Catholics, of Catholic hospitals, of all kinds of people who are involved in the countries, that are at war. So there is a major humanitarian part that the Catholic Church plays in a lot of these places. And so rightly, the Vatican also wants to have a say, as it were, but mostly they want to have a say for the sake of human dignity and peace, and that's something which is quite apart from any one pope. The Vatican has always been involved in that, and the Secretary of State has a whole diplomatic school that the priests who work in the Secretary of State go to become diplomats, and there are nuncios in every country, which are papal ambassadors, and they have embassies, and so there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes in terms of peace. And then of course you have the Pope, who can get a lot of media attention and call attention to certain places in the world. So I do think a lot of political leaders appreciate that. Whether it actually brings about any real practical solutions, I don't know, but it's an important element to have.
Definitely. And if anything, it changes the tone a little. The church's citizens, so to say, expand in every country. And it really is unique in that way. I mean, even now with Pope Leo being an American citizen, there's been this back and forth about, people like Vice President J.D. Vance going to visit, and then your citizenship as a nation, you're an American citizen, but then also you're a bit of a Vatican citizen as well. You've got a bit of this, loyalty, but also this, your home or is as a Catholic. And so, the church's citizens, so to say, not actual citizens, spread throughout the entire world. So they're one of the unique organizations that do that, but it does also create kind of a difficult aspect for the diplomats who are Catholic, who also need to represent their country, because you can be at odds there. I mean, even J.D. Vance received so much backlash for not kissing the ring of the Pope and things of that sort. What is your take on that, having seen that over the years? Has that always been the case?
Well, I think it's interesting because if you look back in the 60s with Kennedy, that was a big problem. Like, oh, he's going to be under the thumb of the Pope and we can't have a Catholic because of that. So now we've really come full circle where not only do we have like an American Pope, but we have a Catholic vice president visiting the American Pope, and I get it, and I think people understand that in his role as vice president representing the United States, he didn't want to be seen to be bowing down to another authority. So also we have to understand, even with the Pope, Robert Prevost, American citizen, is now Pope Leo in the office of the Pope. So he's not a private citizen in that sense anymore, right? And so when we see him, or when he's greeting another head of state, he's greeting him in his as his representative, in his office.
Right.
And so there is that distinction to make, and even it has to be made in the interior of each person that takes that on. So vice president or Pope or diplomat. There has always been a question in political life in the United States about Catholics and, who are they taking their orders from? And so I think that's something that every Catholic who's involved in politics has to weigh up. We've seen that a lot, for example, with the abortion issue or things like that. And there's never really been a satisfactory answer. Depends on whether you're more progressive or you're more conservative, about whether or not you need to, in political life, follow what the Catholic Church teaches. And, you'll get different answers to that depending on who the person is. But I think obviously for most Catholics, you will try in all aspects of your life to keep in mind the teachings of the Church and to follow them as much as possible, and to speak out for them.
But more specifically, I'm not jealous of J.D. Vance. I wouldn't want to be in that
tough position.
situation.
Yes, I
yeah,
agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you have also covered several other areas. I mean, you covered Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn, and you've covered the Dead Sea Scrolls. I believe you did a deep...
Did that at Oxford, yeah. Well, that was part of,
these are all very intimate, personal beliefs and historical attributes. Is there anything very difficult about always covering what seems to be very personal things to people, very personal beliefs to a certain extent? Yes.
It's very difficult. And I thought about that a lot when I was on CNN, because you don't have a lot of time to explain things, and you want to do it in a way which is accurate, which explains things to people who are not Catholic, but you don't want to offend Catholics. It's very complicated to speak in a kind of sensitive way to everybody's interests, and especially with time limits. So yes, it is complicated. Absolutely. Because you probably are going to, there's so many viewers, who knows what they think. So my attitude is I just have to be unbiased as possible in the sense of try and think of things from all perspectives. Of course, know exactly what is the news that you're trying to get across, and then it is what it is, sort of thing. But a lot of that can be nuanced, right? So, I don't know, something, a document like Fiducia Supplicans, or on the blessings of same-sex marriages and things. There's a lot of nuance in there depending on how you say it and how you present it, and those do get tricky.
Yeah, especially in this rapid fire age.
Exactly. And so anything can be kind of taken out of context. You need longer time. In that sense, writing is a little bit better than doing something video or just quick snippets. You do need to take the time to read documents, which a lot of people do not do. And if you're just reading somebody's take on X, that's probably not going to give you the best understanding. And so that's certainly my recommendation to anybody who's interested, is go and read the original documents. They're not that hard to read, but you'll get a sense of why it's also very complicated sometimes to put it into very simple, this is progressive, this is conservative, this is black, this is white. The mindset doesn't, especially with Francis, it didn't work that way, So maybe with somebody like Ratzinger, that was a bit easier, Pope Benedict. But Francis certainly threw up a lot of things in the air that needed to be analyzed, and could have been analyzed in different ways depending on your personal standing. So that was, yes, very complicated.
Yeah, that's exceptionally complicated. I saw a great quote somewhere that was, he's making everyone upset, so therefore he's probably right. Because I think, again, it's a proclivity of everyone to put we have an inclination to put people in boxes, and we always want to do that. And with Francis, it was impossible.
Yes.
And then I wonder if Leo, from your gut check, do you think Leo is going to be more similar to Ratzinger? Do you think to Pope
I think
Benedict?
he's a nice combination of both. And I want to say this about the Catholic Church and progressives and conservatives and this and that. I had the great fortune of before Oxford, I was at the University of San Francisco, which is a Jesuit university, and I took part in the St. Ignatius Institute, which was a great books program run by Father Joseph Fessio, who was a student of Ratzinger. I think it was one of the first kind of great books, classical education within the Jesuit University of USF. And then I went to Oxford to Blackfriars with the Dominicans, where you had conservative Dominicans and progressive Dominicans, and they all talked together, and they all ate together, and they all laughed together. The Catholic Church is a both and there is room, and I understand deeply all of the conversations, and I get into them myself, and is it this way and is it that way, and but canon law says this, and the liturgy should be like that. But one of the wonderful things I think about being Catholic is that you can have all of that discussion, and we have had since the early centuries of the church. Are we allowed to do this? Well, you can do it like this. So those are natural human discussions and questions, and it's great that we are able to stay together but also engage in those very deeply.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting, especially now with an age in which conversation for a moment there sort of felt like it stopped, where for so long, especially you talked about the bipartisan of America and how extreme it's become, that still this institution is able to hold so many different traditions within its walls and maintain it. It's a unique thing in the modern age, I think, and something to be cherished very much so. Yeah. Well, okay, I have rapid fire questions.
Oh dear, I never do. I don't like those.
They're
I'm
fun.
An old timer. I told you we need time. We need time to ponder.
They're fun and simple. Okay, so rapid fire round. All right, 1 minute you get per question. Favorite pope of all time?
No, I'm not going to answer
Really?
that.
You can go far back.
Oh,
It doesn't have to be. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's say John Paul II.
Okay, he's a good one. Underrated saint.
Well, I would have said maybe Augustine. Now he's coming back up because I think everyone should read his Confessions and realize what a saint really is, like what kind of a life a saint can really have. And I think that's wonderful that we have an Augustinian, because I hope that people will understand. They always think, oh, saint has to be just the perfect person. Well, go read Augustine.
Go read Augustine. It's a great bit. Go read Augustine. Okay, this one's fun. Most Catholic country, in your opinion?
Poland?
Really? Okay.
Poland springs to mind. I mean, I've been there a few times with the popes, and deeply, deeply, reverent, and it's so wrapped up also in their history.
Right.
And again, going back to John Paul II, but I was there even with Benedict. They love their Catholic Church. Yeah.
Love it. That's fantastic. And then, finally, finish this sentence. For Pete's sake, I just wish that people would understand
that the Catholic Church can hold all these different opinions and sensibilities together.
I love it.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah,
awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Delia Gallagher. Oh my goodness, it was lovely. We will be back next week with more. Thank you for joining us here on For Pete's Sake podcast. Delia Gallagher again, thank you for coming in.
Thank you, Charlotte.